Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, let's make a start. This is going to be weird. So the handheld, so I'm a pop star? No, I'm not. Not attractive enough, right? I'm not joining a K-pop team, I don't think. Right, that would be pretty bad. I can't sing. I have no artistic skills whatsoever. I can't draw. I can't paint. I can't sing. So I'm a man of numbers, I suppose. So speaking of numbers, let's look at some. To not embarrass myself, I have to use this. The handheld microphone is, well, of course, it's week 3. It's already broken, right? So it's good. So I might have to do this for the lecture as well. It's going to be funny. So for those listening, I'm actually using a microphone. So it's my training to become a politician, which I wish I would never become, right? Because I would just tell everybody you're stupid, and if you do that, nobody will vote for you, right? So, if you yell at people and make fun of them to their face, well, not make fun of them, but accuse them for being ignorant and passive, which I do every day, they wouldn't vote for you. So this is not going. It wouldn't work. So today is a proper workshop. Last week it was more very general, but this is what the workshops are going to be like. They're going to be me trying to help you with the assignment directly, actually giving you guidance on what you're supposed to be doing. You don't have to follow that guidance because there are different ways to enter in. So today we're going to talk about historical information. Next week as well, we're going to talk about historical information and entering that information from the JB Hi-Fi and historical statements, so accounting statements, to the KGW model. You know, if you want to, there is, and I'll talk about it as well, there's different ways you can do things, which will give you the same answer. It's all correct. It's just me giving you guidance of what I would do, but what I would do isn't necessarily the correct answer. There's no answers in this assignment. Everybody has a different point of view. There's incorrect things. If you put COGS into non-operating expenses, that's incorrect, right? That's a deduction when I mark the assignment. So don't do something stupid like that. But like, for example, depreciation expense, we'll talk about that today. If you look at the JB Hi-Fi annual statement, income statement or statement of profit and loss, sometimes it's called. In Australia, it used to be called a profit of statement and loss. So maybe when you go, I'm talking far back though. If you value a company, you go back to like 2004, 2003, 2002. It's actually called statement of profit and loss. Now it's called an income statement. It means the same thing. It's just in Australia, we changed our accounting standards. We had our own Australian accounting standards, and we adopted IFRS, International Accounting Standards, so now we call it an income statement. Right? But income statement, statement of profit and loss, whatever you like. Actually, they call it here, statement of profit and loss, for whatever reason. But that's not required by law. You can call it, as long as it's either statement of profit or loss or income statement, it means the same thing. Most companies call it income statement. So JB Hi-Fi wants to be traditional, no problem. All right. So let's have a look here. So I'll help you with the items that are not obvious. Obviously, with things like revenue, you put it in revenue, right? I mean, if you can't do that, then I don't know. I cannot help you in this course. Maybe you should do something else. Finance is not for you, right? If you can't put revenue in revenue, then there's something wrong, right? So you should do something else. Study history, right? I always wanted to study history when I was a student, but I didn't do that. So with stuff, so when we go through the income statement, as you can see, revenue. The only mistake you can make here is the units. Some accounting statements have it in, just pay attention to the units. That's the only mistake you can really make here. If you, what do we got here? Where am I? So this is my USB. This, and let's open up the 2017 report. Go to the statement of profit and loss. As you can see, there's a switch here. So this is in millions now, all right? So that's a mistake that you can make. Please don't make this mistake. The company, it's not required that companies are not required to report everything in thousands or millions. They can switch. And as you can see, JB Hi-Fi did that. Easy fix, thousands, millions, just divide by to get millions, multiplied by divide by 1,000. It's not that complicated. But just it's a stupid mistake or a bad error to make to get that mixed up. So always, everybody's like, oh, they start here, looking here. It's like, and read left to right, just like humans are hardwired to read left to right, especially in the West. But everything is important. Take a look at the year, take a look at the units. And if you didn't, you would make a mistake because, as you can see, JB Hi-Fi most likely is going to continue producing their annual statements in millions, but in the past it was in thousands. I told the model, KGW model, that you would be entering your information in millions. And you cannot select enter some years in thousands and some years in millions. It has to be consistent for all the historical information that you input in KGW. So if you're going back all the way to 2009, make sure that everything you enter in is in millions, please. Do not switch. Do not switch between millions and thousands. The model cannot do that. It doesn't have that flexibility. Right? The units are clearly defined, and they all have to be in those units. So let's have a look here. So so for each workshop, I'll have notes that look like this, usually one page, that is designed to help you. The workshops and the lectures are usually the workshops. Is where you can ask your questions from the assignment, for the assignment. You can, of course, come up to me after the workshop if there's time, but I think there's a class at 10, so we'll probably have to take it outside the room. Okay, let's start. So first, once you have your team, all teams are formed. There are 50 teams. Ouch, that's a lot of assignments to mark. That's why I get paid the big bucks, right? So the first step of the assignment, once you have your team formed, is to start entering historical information. So your first step is to, as a team, open up KGW and start entering historical information, starting with 2009. I, as an analyst, always like to start back. I always like to start entering in the latest year first and work my way backwards. But you can do it either way, it's up to you. I always like doing that, but whatever works for your team, it's your choice. But you don't need to go back beyond 2009. You don't need to go back to 2008 or 2007 or anything like that. Yeah. So you start here on this tab, and you work your way down. You start from this income statement or statement of profit and loss, whatever you want to call it, and you start entering in from top down. Then you move to the statement of changes in equity. We'll talk about that mostly next week. Top down, his balance sheet, top down, asset section, liability section, equity section, and then the off-balance sheet items. Most of these will be zero. Obviously, the capital expenditure will not be zero, but things like these items here, yeah, all of them will be zero, I think. Goodwill written off, that can be zero. This will not be zero. JB Hi-Fi has a lot of operating leases, so because they don't own all their stores. Like I mentioned, the Westfield, here in the city, the JB Hi-Fi store, Westfield will not allow you to buy the store, the location. They will only allow you to rent it or lease it, if you like. And some locations, especially in Victoria, where the company started, they own the locations. They actually own the building and they own the land. So it's not a lease. They don't have to pay rent. But in many in all Westfield shopping centers, they have to pay rent. DFO, the DFO in Fishwick, the JB Hi-Fi store, the biggest one in Canberra, that's a lease as well. DFO does not allow you to buy the location. They give you a 5-year lease or a 10-year lease or something like that. Depends what you negotiate. And then we will need the number of shares, of course. We can get the market value of equity. That's always useful. I'll show you how to do that probably next week workshop. And this information, you don't need that. You don't need the BAB rate, really. The risk-free and the WACC, maybe for 2018, and the rest can be blank. Okay? So not everything will be entered into the historical data type. It's not required. Again, this is a general model, and we have to use it for the specific purposes of valuing JB Hi-Fi. So JB Hi-Fi, for example, doesn't have income smoothing provisions. Where is it? That's a very American thing. I think I mentioned that in another last week's workshop. That will be blank. Okay, so let's start. So the 2008 report is still not available yet. Hopefully next week. Yeah, next week it should be available. So fingers crossed. But that's okay. You're busy with other. You have plenty of historical information you need to enter into. You need to enter into KGW. So you can start with the 2016. 2016, yeah. So you can start, you can fill these years for now, because remember the 2018 report, we're going to be using that for the 2018 and the 2017 year, right? We will not use the 2017 report to enter in 2017 information because it's not as up-to-date. More up-to-date 2017 numbers will be in the 2018 report. Companies do restate their annual statements. Usually the adjustments are small, but still, you want to have the most accurate information. So you generally wait for the best report, but we can be busy for now with all this historical information. So if I was you and I haven't started the assignment, I would start in 2016. You get the 2016 numbers from the 2017 report, which is available. It's on Waddle as well, but you can get it from the company website. You can get it from the Australian Securities Exchange, whatever works, right? So, and work your way backwards. Or you can start in 2009 and work your way forwards. So hopefully next week we'll have that report. So let's start with this income statement. What do I have for you here? So first of all, the revenue is in revenue. So I'm not going to help you with that. That's obvious. I got one email yesterday. Remember, you're not supposed to email me assignment questions. You're supposed to ask them in the workshop. So don't email me. There's just too many students for me to handle. I have 600 students and no teaching assistant. So There's only 24 hours in the day. There's no 28. I wish there was, but there isn't. So the question was about this other income. Where do you put it? Do you treat it as operating and non-operating? JB Hi-Fi doesn't tell you, correct? First of all, it's small, but just because it's small, it's only $500,000. That's nothing for a company that has $4 billion in sales. But still, you shouldn't ignore it. With stuff like that, first of all, when it's small, it doesn't matter if you treat it as operating or non-operating because it doesn't have any impact on the valuation given how small this is. So it's your choice. I would, when I'm uncertain, I always treat it as operating. So what you can do is for this other income, this other revenue, if you like, you would just add it to the other revenue, and after you add it both, put it all into revenue. So your revenue will be different to what JB Hi-Fi says, but only because of that extra $500,000 or something like that in sales. And what you do then practically, of course, you don't just do it and assume that I remember or anything like that. You add a note, right? You add a note and say, and this is not just for me, this is for you as well, you know, sum of revenue and other income. Wow, this microphone is starting to annoy me. I need two hands. I need two hands. I need three hands, right? Maybe it would help. Right? And then put it in here. Right? So that's what you can do with the other revenue. If you want to treat it as non-operating for whatever reason, I will not stop you. It's not incorrect. The company doesn't say whether it's operating or non-operating, so it's up to you. So you can put it as non-operating income. It's somewhere here, non-operating income, and say this is other income. Oh, not format. I don't want format. Go away. Insert other revenue. And put it in here. You can do that. Because the number is so small, it will not impact the valuation of a $4 billion revenue company. $500,000 for a $4 billion revenue business is nothing. It just, my only concern there is just be consistent in your team. Because one problem I see students make is, let's say there's 5 of you in a team, one person will do 2 years, the other 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 person will do 2 years, right? That's fine, you can divide your tasks any way you like, but if you, as a team, 2 of you will put other income as non-operating, and the other 3 of you will put it as part of revenue, that's incorrect, that's a subtraction. I take marks off for that. Do not make that mistake. Just be consistent. When it's ambiguous, I will not deduct marks because JB Hi-Fi doesn't tell you it's non-operating, you operate, doesn't provide details. So I cannot deduct marks if you treat it as operating or non-operating, but I can deduct marks if you switch, because that's an error. You have to be consistent across all the years, all the historical years. Any questions on that? And again, it's a small number. You know, it doesn't matter. Just it's even small enough. Some analysts would, when some analysts look at that, they would even ignore it, which I don't like doing. $500,000 is still $500,000. I know it's very small. It's like less than 1%, but you want to be complete. So these notes are. I was looking through the 2016 report to generate these notes, but they apply to all the other reports as well, of course. What do we have here? So the 2016 report, you go to the report to get the 2015 numbers, remember? So you get the 2016 numbers from the 2017 report, which is already available. So first stop, cost of goods sold. So COGS is for a retailer, of course, the biggest operating expense that any retailer has. COGS is by far the biggest for any retailer. So JB Hi-Fi doesn't call it cost of goods sold, it calls it cost of sales. It's the same thing. Same thing. So treat cost of sales as COGS. This. Yeah. Next. Oh, I'll get to depreciation. So this is important. So I got already quite a few questions after the lecture as well. People came up to me, what about depreciation? It's a very good question. As you can see, no depreciation here. But when you search depreciation, they do have some, of quite a few actually, as you would expect. Yeah, it's here. When you calculate operating EBITDA, When you go from EBITDA to EBIT, the company clearly tells you that there's about 41 million in depreciation in 2016 and 39 million in 2015. As you can see, quite stable, the depreciation, because we have straight line depreciation, just like I said in class on Monday. So depreciation doesn't vary a lot, but it does exist. 40 million is not small, you cannot ignore it, and it should be an expense on an income statement, but JB Hi-Fi is trying to be annoying, and annoy me and you, and not give us the number as a separate line item. So all of these are called line items, they're all separate accounts. It's not a regulatory requirement, it should be, but it's not a requirement for a company to have depreciation expense as a separate line item here. So they combined it somewhere. So we as and they don't tell you where in the annual statements, right? So we as analysts then have to make an assumption. I mean, you can look it up, you can Google it. If you Google JB Hi-Fi, and I did that, and some student came to me after the lecture asking about it, saying they Googled it as well. Wow. Oh man, these speeds. Oh, yeah, ouch. Windows 10, yeah, no good. You install Windows 10 on a machine that's designed for Windows XP. Bad idea. So what do we got here? JB Hi-Fi depreciation. Wow, this one hand is annoying me. Depreciation expense, a part of COGS. So what you get here, you get a few, so the Wall Street Journal is a good source. They provide annual statements for the companies in their breakdown. As you can see, they have the sales, revenue, whatever you want, and they have depreciation, part of COGS. All right? And the student said, well, I went somewhere else, and they have it part of SGA. So what do I do? Well, it's a good question. So again, just like with the other revenue, it doesn't matter for the assignment because the EBIT will still be the same, and for the valuation it will have no impact. So depreciation expense, my advice would be to assume it's part of cost of sales. So subtract the depreciation number, which for 2016 was about 41 mil almost, from cost of sales. So your cost of sales, your COGS in KGW will not be the same as cost of sales on the JB Hi-Fi income statements because you have to subtract depreciation from there and enter it as a separate number in the depreciation section of KGW. So we're doing this in millions. We go to the depreciation expense for 2016, put in the exact number, but whatever it was, 40.9 and change, whatever it was, and it will be subtracted. You will have COGS here of, what is it? That's 2017, so 2016 number, so about 3 bill. So you'll have 3,089. So you have 3,089.1 minus that 40.9. Yeah. And so that way, and leave a note, of course. Please leave a note. Always leave notes to yourself and to whoever's marking it. And your colleagues, if you're an analyst as well, you should leave notes all the time what you're doing. And you can say COGS, cost of sales, minus depreciation, and say where you got the number 2. Always say where it comes from. Note 2 or whatever it was. All right, so what was it? Let's have a look. It's note 2 of the annual statements. All right, say where it comes from. You can do the page number as well if you like. Page 62. Yes, question? The decimal points? Yeah, sure. So the decimal points, so this is 40.901. Yeah, so no, it has decimals. It's Excel, so it has plenty of decimals, 0.0 like that. Is that what you mean? Or you mean like viewing it? Well, if you want to see it, no problem. You can just do that if you want. Yeah, so it's up here is the decimal selection in Excel. So whatever you like. You can have 3 decimal points, 4, 5, up to you. Yeah. If you have no decimals, Excel doesn't take this as 41. I think if that's what you're asking. It takes it as 40.901. So the calculation is still correct, but yeah, you can play with the decimals, whatever you like. Yeah. Any other questions? It's a good question. Yeah. I always like 2 decimals, but in this case you would only have 40.90, but so you need 3 to have the full number. So have 3, up to you. Yeah. Okay. So if you don't like taking it from COGS, if you don't like to subtract the depreciation expense from cost of sales, you can subtract it from SGA. You can even subtract it from occupancy. The student that was asking me on Monday said that, oh, occupancy expense contains depreciation. I'm sure it does. You can. It's not incorrect. Again, what would be incorrect is if 2 team members have depreciation being subtracted from cost of sales, and the other 3 team members, when they were entering the data for their years, subtracted it from SGA. That would be an error. That would be incorrect. Don't make that stupid, silly mistake. I've seen it plenty of times. So if you want to subtract, the depreciation expense, which is, again, it's in here somewhere in the annual statement, in the income statement. It's in here somewhere, but obviously it can only be in a few places. It's not in revenue. Obviously, that's income. It most likely is in COGS. It's not other income, that's income. It could be in SGA, it could be in occupancy. It won't be in administration because depreciation is not an administrative cost. Other expenses, that's too small. So that's only 38 and depreciation was 40, so that's not in there. It won't be in finance cost, that's interest costs, and they're too small. It won't be in admin cost, again, because it's too small. So it can be in here, here, or here. It can't be anywhere else. So you have to subtract it from one of those 3. And you can choose which one. COGS makes sense. SGA also makes sense. Occupancy, if you close one eye, makes sense. You just have to be consistent for all the years. And do not have depreciation as 0. That's incorrect. That will have a big impact on the CapEx forecasting, like I said in class on Monday. You cannot have, just because JB Hi-Fi doesn't have depreciation on the income statement doesn't mean you have a right as an analyst to have it at 0. That's incorrect. That would affect your CapEx forecast. You would understate the CapEx, understate the CapEx, understate the invested capital, overestimate your ROIC. Yeah, you would get ROIC that's too high. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So next thing, amortization, write-down, and goodwill. So amortization, write-down of goodwill, and intangibles. There is a separate section in the annual statements on that. I don't want to, with one hand, these are adverse conditions. Where is it? There it is. So you got intangibles, quite a few of them, right? You've got, So in note 10, looks like you've got intangibles. Looks like JB Hi-Fi has a few intangible assets. Goodwill makes sense. Brand name, yep, makes sense. Location premiums, that usually means you're located in premium locations. Your stores are in Westfield with a lot of foot traffic. Rights to profit share, they have some kind of an alternative investment there, probably a joint venture of some kind. As you can see, not much movement, not much change. The only change is really because of exchange differences, and it's very small. So what do you do there? So let's go back to the income statement. Yeah, and that's why I said it. So I got a question. So it's not in the income statement, but I got a question after the lecture about these. Say, what do we do with them, right? They're intangibles. Do we need to value them separately? Do we need to do any additional, what do we do, was the question with intangibles. The reason is you don't have to do much because like I just showed you in Note 10, they don't move that much, you know. They're big, yeah. If you go to the balance sheet, they're not small, intangible assets. Right. Yeah, they're not tiny. So that's, what do we got here? So, not small, right? Over $1 billion, right? But and they've grown. They had there was an acquisition, that's why they've grown. But as you can see, that's the 2017 report. They were much more reasonable in 2016. They had a big acquisition, that's why the jump. That was the Good Guys acquisition. But as you can see, they're not small, even in 2016, 100 million. But to answer the question, you don't have to do much because you don't have to model them separately. You don't have a separate discounted cash flow or anything like that because they don't change much. It's not. It's like. It's like Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, the biggest asset they have on the balance sheet is the brand name, the intangible asset. It's worth billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, right? But it doesn't change much in value. It's already established. Same sort of thing here. The goodwill, the brand name, the location premiums, they're all established. They don't change that much, so don't worry about it. You don't have to worry about it much to answer that student's question. So it's very small and the changes. Yeah. So the amortization or the write-down, that means the change, in other words, change in intangibles. So amortization, intangible, the reason why it's here in the workshop notes is after depreciation, the depreciation of intangible assets is called amortization or write-down, if you like. It's not large. So your amortization of intangibles, you put that number in notes from Note 10 or wherever the section is of what the change is per year, but it's going to be very small. Right. And usually it's a write-down, so it's a negative number, it's an expense. Yeah. So whoever asked that question was a good question after the lecture, but not too bad. Okay. So into 2017 report, again, you have to search for it. Like I showed you, I can't do this with one hand. Yeah. So it's Note 11 in the 2017 report. So Note 10 doesn't stay Note 10. So the notes change around a little bit, but in terms of numbering. But they'll be the same format. Yeah. And as you can see, very small change. It's tiny. Right? It actually goes up. Right? Because of exchange differences. Right? So exchange rates move every day. So everything else stays the same. So no problem. What do we have here? SGA. So they call it, so it's called SGA in KGW. Right here, SGA, Selling General and Admin Expenses. So in the KGW report here in the income statement, you have a few SGAs. You have the sales and marketing expense and the administration expense. Add those two numbers together. They're both negative because they're both expenses. And once you add those two numbers, put them in into the SGA row, which I think is row 11. Row 11, yeah. Next, what we have here is occupancy expenses. So again, occupancy expenses, they're here. That's usually the rental they have to pay, the rent the JB Hi-Fi has to pay for the locations they cannot buy or don't want to buy. They're operating, of course. They're not non-operating, they're operating expenses. You can place them in SGA. There's two choices. Again, the only mistake you can make is if you're inconsistent. So you can put, there's no operating occupancy expense section in KGW in the income statement there. So you have to put it somewhere. And you can either put it in SGA with the sales and marketing and administration expenses. If you don't like that, you can also put it in other operating expenses, row 12. So row 11, row 12, put it wherever you like, but just be consistent across all years. Because if you switch, because one student did these years and another student did these years, there'll be a jump in SGA or other operating expenses, which will be like, whoa, if you use historical average with that jump, it's going to be incorrect. That's the problem there. So a lot of these, as I said in class, a lot of these expenses we'll just do as a percentage of revenue because it's a retailing company. They work on a margin, so a lot of the percentage of revenue costs like COGS, like SGA will be very stable. Once you enter in historical information, you'll see historically how these expenses are as a percentage of revenue, and they will be stable. But if you switch between putting occupancy expenses or whatever it is from SGA to other operating expenses or vice versa, you'll have a jump. And then if you use a historical average, you'll use of the last, let's say, 5 years or whatever it is, you'll use an artificially low or artificially high average, which is incorrect. Yeah, I take marks off for that. That's a silly mistake. Do not make it. Yeah. So when you either put it in SGA or other expenses, just be consistent and don't anger me. Yeah. Next, finance costs. So what do we got here? We got finance costs here. So with the other expenses, do I say something about other expenses? Doesn't look like I do. Probably should. With the other expenses, does JB Hi-Fi tell us? No, of course they don't, because they're annoying. Companies are annoying. It's not easy as an analyst. You go to the annual statements, just do everything nice, be transparent. No, we don't care, right? That's why you get paid the big bucks. So, as an analyst. So the other expenses, they're not small, so how you classify them is important. With stuff like that, just like with the other revenue, I would treat it as operating. I would treat it as operating. There's an argument for non-operating. I mean, I don't remember the company breaking it down. Sometimes they break down the costs here. But of course, JB Hi-Fi being wonderful, they only break down the costs for one item. Great. In the notes. They might do, the other thing that analysts do is try to match the number. They try to get, where is this 38717? And maybe it's called something else in the notes. So that's quite common. I remember doing that a lot as an analyst and getting angry. Yeah, doesn't work in this case, right? So you can try that in the notes, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And getting close is not good enough. It has to be the same number. So when you don't know, it's not a small number, I would treat it as operating. But if your team, again, treats it as non-operating and does it consistently for all the historical years, I will not deduct marks. That's unfair, because maybe it is non-operating. I don't know. Yeah. But I would treat it as operating in the absence of more information. Next, finance costs. Finance costs are interest costs. It means the same thing, finance costs, interest costs, whatever you want. It gives a breakdown. Always, when the company gives you a breakdown, always go to the note. Don't just say, oh, it's interest costs. No more thinking. No, don't do that. Think. I know thinking hurts. I understand. It's not easy. Thinking hurts. It hurts me to think. So, yeah, it's important. But when you go to the breakdown in note 5, what we see here is, what's the action here? Not too bad. So we've got it's mostly interest, which makes sense. Fair value of a swap, that's an interest expense as well. Other interest expense, yeah, other, right? So some companies have 3 levels of others, right? So they have other expenses on their income statement. You go to, and it gives you all detail in note 4. You go to note 4, and then it says, in the other expenses, there are other expenses, right? And then underneath, there's a small one, other. Right, so it's other expense. God knows what that is, right? 3 levels of others, right? Just say what it is. Right? It's just the cost must be so small that it's not worth it. So it's but you have to record it, otherwise the accounts don't balance. So yeah, I always laugh when I see 3 levels of others. Because it's just because I'm sad. I find stuff like that funny. Yeah. So finance costs are interest expenses in KGW. Put the number in here. Interest expense, row 20. So it's not too bad, but it's not small. Yeah, it's almost 4 million. So, yeah. Next, what do I have for you? Minority. Yes, question? Very good question. So if there is any interest income, there is a separate section here, row 19. So it's not a net cost. I've seen students net it out, and some analysts do that as well. They sort of don't have a separate item for income and expense. But because KGW gives you the flexibility, have the income on a separate section, and any expense as a separate section. So it is an expense, to answer your question, but if there is any interest income for the company, record it in row 19. Correct. It's interest cost. No, there is no interest income. Well, let's check. Note 5, maybe there is. There's always possible that it is there. That's why they give a breakdown, I suppose, so we can check this. Maybe you're right. Let's have a look. Interest on loans, fair value, loss, and an interest expense. So interest on loan is an expense. This is an expense as well, and it's a loss. I mean, you can, if it was a gain, you can treat that as an income and have it separate. I think it's too much trouble because the swaps are not large. Any changes are very small, as you can see, like $100,000, which is nothing for such a $4 billion business. So I would probably not worth the effort to break it down, have it as a net figure and have it as an expense, just like JB Hi-Fi does it here in note 5, maybe note 5 in another report as well, and have the net figure as an expense. It's not worth the trouble to break it down if it's a gain of $100,000. Yeah. Correct. So if they don't have any income whatsoever, or maybe they have a little income in 1 year from the swap or whatever it is, interest will never, loans will never generate an income, right? It's always an expense. But if they have a gain from a swap because the exchange rate with the New Zealand dollar was favorable, it went up during the year, then you could break it down in the income, in the interest income, and have that section, that gain. If that was, let's say, a gain of 92, not a loss of 92, you can have that as in row 19, but it's not worth it. It's just too small. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions? So the question for those listening is, do we need to break down income and expense for the interest costs? If they're so small here, as you can see, you can if you want. It's not worth it. But you don't switch, again, just like with the classification of depreciation or other expenses that are not quite clear, or occupancy. Where do you put that? You have to be consistent for all the years. So if you have all of it aggregating as an expense, have it all of it as a net expense for all the years. Next, leases. Ooh, big one. Oh no, minority interest, sorry. JB Hi-Fi does not have minority interest now, but it did in the past. Don't forget that these apply. Just because they're not around 2017, 2016, so if I go to the annual statements here, I can see, if I go to the income statement, no payments to minority interests here. Right, nothing. But in the past, there would probably be down here somewhere. So when that happens, you cannot ignore that. Right? KGW, too many acronyms. JB Hi-Fi, KGW, too many. They're called non-controlling interests in Australia. In the US, they're called minority interest. It means the same thing. A KGW does allow you to enter income pertaining to those minority interests here. That's the income. Remember, income and assets different are entered here. Yeah. So do not mix the two. The assets or the liabilities or the equity comes from the balance sheet, and the income comes from the income statement of JB Hi-Fi. So when you go in the past, there is some minority interest. You enter that information through here, row 25. Yeah. The JB Hi-Fi income attributable to non-controlling interests appears in KGW income statement. It's a negative figure, please, not a positive figure. So that's the income figure. And the JB Hi-Fi non-controlling equity interest appears in the balance sheet. It has to be in both. You cannot have income going to minority interests if you have no minority interest in the balance sheet. That's a mistake. Again, quite a few students make that mistake. Right. And don't be confused by the term minority interest, non-controlling interest. Call it whatever you want. It's the same thing. Okay. So this is important. Operating leases. So if you go to operating leases, you should capitalize them. What does that mean? If you go to the balance sheet, there's two ways you can do this, and I think I'll talk about it in lecture 4, I think. Let's have a look here. So if you go to the income statement, we've got the occupancy expense, which are mostly leases. I'm assuming JB Hi-Fi doesn't give a detailed breakdown, but when you go to the balance sheet, you go to the liability section, you don't see leases anywhere. What? Should be in the liability section. I don't see any leases anywhere. Which means that they are underestimating, and this is a big problem when you're calculating ROIC if you don't do this. So they have a lot of leases because of this. You cannot buy most stores, especially if they're in the shopping center. But as you can see, it's not the capital commitment. You sign a contract, a 5-year lease, a 10-year lease. So you actually, it's a loan, if you like. It's an operating lease. So you need it actually to operate the company, to operate the business model, which is selling electronics from a store, from an actual store. It's not online. So you need those leases to run the company. If you just have the expense coming through the income statement, and you don't have the commitment, the contract you signed, the value of that contract that you signed, those 10 years worth of commitments that you made in the balance sheet, you will underestimate your invested capital. You will overestimate your ROIC. That's a mistake. I deduct marks for that. So because the company doesn't do it, we as analysts have to do it. One way we can do it is by using these off-balance sheet items down here. This is why I said for JB Hi-Fi, this will be required here. I'll talk about this more in lecture 4, whatever it is, but we can have lease expense. We need lease expense numbers for each year. We need an interest rate on those leases, and we need the average life of the lease, of an average lease. And leases have different lives, that's true, but we need the average number. If you go to note 80 of the 2016 report, you'll find some information. You'll find that the average life, they have different lives, but let's say the average life is around 6 years. So you can put 6 into that. You can put 6 into here, life of the lease. The 7% is a guess. It's just because I have some friends who have businesses in Westfields. The rents, ouch, are not small. Westfield, those people charge you a lot, right? So I have a lease rate of around 7%, which is about right for how much they get charged. Which is, think of it like an interest expense, right? Interest these days, you can get a loan for 4%. When I had a mortgage, I paid 3.87%. That's very low. And I'm an individual, not a company. So if it's a lease, think of it like a loan, 7%, that's a high loan, right? But the reason why it's so high is because the shopping centers do charge a lot. And then in note 5, if you refer to note 5 in the report, you'll find that part of the occupancy expense it was 170, right? Well, about 100 of that is directly that rental expense, right? And you'll find that information in note 5 in the annual report. I don't have time. You can look that up. That's obvious. Yeah. Next, what you need to enter in the off-balance sheet section here is the number of shares. You need that information because it goes directly to here, the number of shares. You need the number of shares to calculate the value per share. Right. You can find that in the notes, usually towards the end of the notes. So a small number of shares are periodically issued and bought back by the company to satisfy any option plans. So it's about 98 million fully paid ordinary shares is what should go into that number for 2016, into that row, sorry, here, year end. Yeah. Sometimes the company gives an average as well. The average is average for the year. That's what that means. Right. Next, dividends. The company pays dividends, a lot of dividends. Well, so they appear as a negative number in KGW. It's almost 100 million in 2016. You'll find that in the